The galaxy had forgotten about Earth a long time ago. 3,000 years had passed since the last ship from that small blue planet had been seen in the stars. The great empires of the galactic conquered spoke of humans the way parents spoke of monsters under the bed. They were stories told to children. They were warnings whispered in the dark. They were nothing more than a fairy tale. The Imperium ruled the galaxy with an iron fist. Their warships darkened the skies of 100 conquered worlds. Their soldiers marched through the streets of fallen civilizations. Their emperor sat upon a throne built from the bones of species that had dared to resist. For 800 years, no one had challenged them. No one had survived long enough to try twice. Commander stood on the observation deck of the flagship Eternal Dominion and watched the planet below burn. They had been a proud people once. They had built cities that touched the clouds and ships that sailed between the stars. Now their world was ash. Their cities were rubble. Their people were slaves. Felt nothing as he watched the fires spread across the continents. This was the way of things. The strong conquered. The weak served. They had proven themselves the strongest species in the galaxy, and everyone else existed only to kneel before them. His second officer approached with a data tablet. "Commander, we have received a strange report from the outer territories." Did not turn from the window. "What kind of report?" "A merchant vessel claims to have detected signals from beyond the dead zone. Radio waves carrying language patterns and mathematical sequences." Finally looked at his officer. The dead zone was a vast region of empty space at the edge of the galaxy. No one went there. No one lived there. It was a graveyard of ancient stars and forgotten worlds. "They are fools," said. "Their sensors malfunction and they see ghosts. Ignore the report." The officer hesitated. "Sir, the patterns match the old records, the ones from before the purge." His eyes narrowed. He knew what the officer meant. 3,000 years ago, they had encountered a small species on a tiny planet in an unremarkable solar system. The humans had been primitive by galactic standards, barely capable of traveling to their own moon. But they had possessed something dangerous. They had possessed ambition. The emperor of that era had ordered the humans exterminated before they could become a threat. A fleet had been sent to their world. The records said the mission was successful. The records said Earth had been reduced to cinders. The records said humanity was extinct. Had always believed those records. Everyone had. "Dispose of the report," he ordered. "Humans are dead. They have been dead for 3,000 years. Whatever the found, it is not them." Far across the galaxy, in the cold darkness beyond the dead zone, a different kind of meeting was taking place. Admiral Jake stood on the bridge of the USS Vanguard and stared at the holographic display before him. The display showed the entire galaxy, with every patrol route, every conquered world, and every military installation marked in red. There was a lot of red. Jake was 62 years old. His hair had turned gray and his face carried the lines of decades spent preparing for a war that might never come. He had been born on a space station hidden in the asteroid belt of a nameless system. He had never seen Earth with his own eyes, but he had heard the stories. He had learned the history. He knew what they had done to his ancestors. And he knew that humanity had not forgotten. Commander walked up beside him. She was younger than Jake by 20 years, with sharp eyes and steady hands. She had commanded her own ship before being promoted to serve as his executive officer. She was one of the finest officers in the fleet. "The patrol reports are in," she said. "All sectors are quiet. They have no idea we exist." Jake nodded slowly. 200 years of silence. 200 years of hiding in the shadows while they burned the galaxy. "It was necessary," said. "We were not ready." "And now?" Allowed herself a small smile. "Now we have 12,000 warships, Admiral. We have weapons they have never seen. We have soldiers who have trained their entire lives for this moment. We are ready." Jake thought about the generations that had come before him. After the attack, A handful of human ships had escaped the destruction of Earth. They had fled into the darkest corner of space they could find. They had hidden. They had survived, and they had begun to rebuild. For 2 centuries, humanity had worked in secret. They had mined asteroids for resources. They had built shipyards in the shadows of dead moons. They had developed technology that the rest of the galaxy could not imagine, and they had waited. The thought humans were extinct. The thought humans were a legend. The thought humans were a fairy tale told to frighten children. They were all wrong. Jake turned to face his crew. The bridge was filled with men and women from every nation that had once existed on Earth. Their ancestors had been American, Chinese, Russian, Brazilian, Indian, and 100 other nationalities. Now they were simply human. They were the children of survivors. They were the descendants of refugees. They were the inheritors of a promise made 200 years ago. That promise was simple. One day, humanity would return. One day, humanity would make the answer for what they had done. One day, the galaxy would learn that Earth was no fairy tale. Set course for the border, Jake ordered. It is time for the universe to remember who we are. The USS Vanguard turned toward the distant stars, and 11,999 warships turned with it. They moved in perfect formation, their engines burning bright against the darkness. They carried no flags of surrender. They broadcast no signals of peace. They were not coming to negotiate. Somewhere in the galaxy, on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, Commander continued to watch the world burn. He did not know that his empire's days were numbered. He did not know that the fairy tale was waking up. He did not know that the silence of 200 years was about to shatter. But he would learn soon enough. They all would. The patrol fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the dead zone and found something impossible waiting for them. Captain stood on the bridge of her flagship and stared at them with her mouth hanging open. She had commanded ships for 40 years. She had seen wonders and horrors beyond counting, but she had never seen anything like this. A wall stretched across the entire sector. Not a physical wall, but a network of structures so dense and so vast that it blocked out the stars behind it. Defense satellites hung in perfect formation, each one bristling with weapons. Sensor arrays swept the void with invisible beams. Weapons platforms the size of small moons drifted in silent rows, their guns pointed outward at the galaxy. "By the ancestors," her navigator whispered, "what is this place?" Did not answer. She could not answer. Her mind was racing through every possibility, every explanation, every logical reason for what she was seeing. None of them made sense. They were a careful people. They had survived the conquests by being useful, by being neutral, by never threatening anyone. Their merchant ships traveled everywhere, and their traders heard everything, knew the locations of every major military installation in the galaxy. This was not supposed to exist. "Captain," her communications officer said, his voice trembling, "our signals are being jammed. I cannot contact the fleet." Felt a chill run down her spine. Whoever had built this wall did not want anyone calling for help. A new contact appeared on the sensors. A single ship emerged from behind a nearby moon, moving with a grace and speed that seemed almost casual. The vessel was unlike anything had seen before. It was sleek and angular with sharp lines and dark hull plating. Weapons covered every surface, but they were not aimed at the fleet. Not yet. The communications console crackled to life. A voice spoke in perfect, without accent or hesitation. "This is Captain Cole of the USS Horizon. You have entered sovereign human territory. State your intentions or be destroyed." Felt her legs go weak. Human. The voice had said human, but that was impossible. Humans were extinct. Humans had been dead for 3,000 years. Humans were a fairy tale. She looked at the ship on her and realized that the fairy tale had very real weapons pointed at her fleet. "This is Ambassador of the Trade Federation," she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could. We come in peace. We mean no harm. We did not know this space was claimed." There was a pause. Then the human voice returned, and thought she heard something like amusement in it. "You did not know because we did not want you to know. Hold your position. A delegation will be sent to escort you. Do not attempt to flee. Do not attempt to send messages. If you cooperate, you will not be harmed." Ordered her fleet to hold position. She had no other choice. The human ship alone was larger than her entire patrol group, and she suspected there were many more hiding behind that impossible wall. The escort arrived within the hour. 12 human warships surrounded the fleet and guided them through the defense network, watched through the as they passed layer after layer of fortifications, asteroid bases, orbital shipyards, fighter squadrons patrolling in perfect formation. Each new sight was more terrifying than the last. And then she saw Earth. The planet hung in the darkness like a blue and green jewel. Clouds swirled across its surface. Oceans sparkled in the light of a yellow sun. Cities glittered on the night side, their lights forming patterns that stretched across entire continents. 8 billion people, Captain Cole said over the communications channel. That is the current population of Earth. We also have colonies on Mars, Venus, and several moons. Total human population across all worlds is approximately 12 billion. Could not speak, the had claimed to have destroyed humanity. The had sworn that no human survived. The had lied. She was taken to the surface by shuttle. Human soldiers escorted her through streets filled with ordinary people living ordinary lives. Children played in parks. Merchants sold goods in marketplaces. Artists painted murals on the sides of buildings. It looked like any civilized world in the galaxy. But it was not any world. It was the world that was supposed to be dead. President Daniel Hayes met her in a simple office with no decorations and no guards. He was a tall man with kind eyes and gray hair, and he shook her hand the way equals greeted each other. "Ambassador," he said, "welcome to Earth. I apologize for the dramatic introduction, but we have learned to be careful." General Torres stood beside the president. She was shorter than Hayes, but carried herself with the confidence of someone who had fought many battles and won them all. Her uniform was simple, but the medals on her chest told a story of service and sacrifice. "We have been watching the galaxy for 200 years, Torres said. "We saw we saw them enslave we saw them crush anyone who dared to stand against them, and we decided that we would not reveal ourselves until we were strong enough to fight back." Found her voice at last. "Why are you showing me this? Why let me see your world, your defenses, your fleet?" President Hayes smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Because we need allies, Ambassador. They burned our first colony a century ago. They thought they had killed us all. They were wrong. Now we are going to make them pay for what they did, and we want them to stand with us when we do." Thought about her people. They had survived by staying neutral, by avoiding conflict, by bowing to whoever was strongest. But looking at the human fleet, looking at the determination in the eyes of the president and his general, she wondered if the galaxy was about to change forever. "What do you want?" she asked. General Torres leaned forward. "We want justice. We want them to answer for their crimes. And we want every species in the galaxy to know that humanity is no fairy tale." Looked out the window at the city below. Millions of humans went about their lives, unaware that their leaders were planning a war that would reshape the stars. They had survived extinction. They had rebuilt in secret. They had become something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. And now they were ready to announce their return. "I will take your message to my people," said, "but I warn you, they are powerful. They have ruled the galaxy for centuries." President Hayes nodded. "They have, but they have never faced us. Not really. Not when we were ready." He gestured toward the window where a human warship was rising from the shipyard into the sky. "Tell your Senate what you have seen here today. Tell them that the legend is real. Tell them that Earth is awake." Watched the warship disappear into the clouds, and knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Emperor of the Imperium sat upon his throne and laughed until tears ran down his face. His advisors stood before him in confused silence, unsure whether their emperor had lost his mind or received wonderful news. "Humans," said between fits of laughter. "They are telling me that humans still exist, that they have a fleet, that they are hiding beyond the dead zone." The spy master who had delivered the report bowed his head low. "The intelligence comes from our agents within the delegation, my lord. Ambassador saw the human world with her own eyes. She met their leaders. She counted their ships." His laughter died. He leaned forward on his throne and fixed the spy master with a cold stare. "Humans were exterminated 3,000 years ago. My ancestor ordered their destruction personally. Every ship was tracked. Every colony was burned. Every last one of them was killed." "Perhaps not everyone, my lord." The throne room fell silent. No one spoke to the emperor that way. No one contradicted him. The spy master kept his eyes on the floor and waited for death, but did not kill him. Instead, the emperor stood and walked to the great window that overlooked the imperial capital. Millions of lived in the city below, secure in the knowledge that their empire was eternal and their enemies were dust. "If this report is true," said quietly, "then it must be dealt with quickly and completely. I will not have fairy tales rising from the grave to threaten my rule." He turned to face his war council. "Assemble a conquest fleet, 500 warships. Send them to the dead zone. Find these humans if they exist and finish what my ancestors started. I want their worlds burning within the month." Admiral Koraz stepped forward and saluted. He was called Koraz the Unbroken because no enemy had ever defeated him. He had crushed 47 species beneath his boots. He had never retreated from a battle. He was the most feared warrior in the galaxy. "It will be done, my lord," Koraz said. "These humans, if they are real, will learn why the galaxy bows to the—" The conquest fleet launched 3 days later. 500 warships, each one carrying thousands of soldiers and enough firepower to crack a planet in half. They jumped into hyperspace with drums beating and flags flying, confident that they were marching toward another easy victory. Admiral Jake received word of the approaching fleet while standing on the bridge of the USS Vanguard. He read the intelligence report twice, then handed it to Commander. 500 ships, he said. "They are sending 500 ships to kill us." Studied the report. "They think we are weak. They think we are primitives who got lucky. They have no idea what is waiting for them." Jake nodded slowly. "Then let us educate them." The human fleet assembled at the edge of the solar system, just beyond the orbit of Neptune. 2,000 warships formed a line across the void, their weapons charged and their crews ready. Behind them, hidden in the asteroid belt and the rings of Saturn, another 2,000 ships waited in reserve. Captain Laura commanded the carrier group from the deck of the USS Liberty. Her pilots were the finest in the fleet, trained since childhood to fly and fight in the darkness between worlds. They sat in their cockpits, fingers resting on their controls, hearts pounding in their chests. Commodore commanded the heavy cruiser division from the USS Thunderbolt. His ships carried the biggest guns in the fleet, weapons that could punch through any armor and break any shield. They were the hammers that would crack the formation. And at the center of the line, Admiral waited aboard the Vanguard. The fleet dropped out of hyperspace and immediately began scanning the area. Admiral Koraz stood on his bridge and watched his tactical display with growing confusion. He had expected to find primitive defenses and outdated ships. Instead, he saw a wall of warships that matched his own in size and exceeded them in number. "What is this?" he demanded. "The report said they had a few hundred vessels at most." His tactical officer shook his head. "Sir, I am counting over 4,000 contacts. They were hiding. They wanted us to underestimate them." Koraz felt something he had not felt in decades. He felt doubt, but he pushed it aside and straightened his back. He was Korra's the Unbroken. He had never lost. He would not lose now. All ships attack formation. We will crush them with superior firepower and courage. Forward. The battle began with a flash of light that could be seen from Earth. Human missiles streaked across the void, their guidance systems locking onto ships with perfect accuracy. Energy weapons returned fire, their beams cutting through space toward the human line. Explosions bloomed in the darkness like flowers of flame. But the human ships did not break. Their shields absorbed hits that should have destroyed them. Their hulls shrugged off damage that would have crippled cruisers, and their weapons struck back with devastating precision. Captain launched her fighter squadrons into the chaos. Thousands of small craft swarmed through the formation, targeting engines and weapons and sensor arrays. They moved too fast for the guns to track, too small for the missiles to hit. Commodore brought his cruisers forward and unleashed everything they had. Plasma bolts the size of houses slammed into warships, melting through armor and detonating reactors. One by one, the enemy vessels began to die. Admiral Korras watched his fleet crumble around him. Ships that had conquered worlds were breaking apart. Warriors who had never known defeat were screaming as their vessels tore themselves to pieces. He had underestimated the humans. He had walked into a trap, and now he was paying the price. 6 hours after the battle began, it was over. 400 warships drifted as burning wreckage. 100 more had surrendered, their crews too shocked to continue fighting. Admiral Korras knelt on the deck of his crippled flagship as human marines stormed through the corridors. Admiral watched the final reports come in. The human fleet had lost fewer than 50 ships. They had lost nearly everything. He opened a channel to every frequency in the galaxy. Every ship, every station, every world with a receiver would hear his words. He took a deep breath and spoke. "This is Admiral Jake of the United Earth Defense Fleet. For 3,000 years you believed humanity was extinct. You believed we were a fairy tale. Today you know the truth. Humanity remembers. Humanity endures. And humanity has returned." Across the galaxy, 100 species heard the message. They heard it in their capital and trembled with rage. They heard it in their council chambers and debated what to do. They heard it in their slave camps and dared to hope for the first time in generations. The silence was over. The legend had become real, and nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same again. Emperor destroyed everything in his throne room when he heard the news. He threw statues through windows. He smashed ancient artifacts against walls. He screamed until his voice gave out, and then he screamed some more. 500 warships gone. Admiral Korras captured. The humans had not just defeated the fleet, they had humiliated it. When the rage finally passed, summoned his war council and spoke in a voice as cold as space itself. "I want every ship we have, every soldier, every weapon. The entire military might of the Imperium will descend upon these humans and wipe them from existence. There will be no survivors. There will be no prisoners. There will be nothing left but ash and memory." The war machine began to move. Shipyards that had been idle for decades roared back to life. Reserve fleets were activated across 100 worlds. Soldiers who had grown soft from easy conquests were retrained for real war. Within 2 months, the largest armada in galactic history had assembled. 10,000 warships, millions of soldiers, enough firepower to destroy a dozen worlds. Emperor stood on the bridge of his new flagship, the Eternal Vengeance, and smiled at the fleet around him. "Let the humans try to stop this," he whispered. But while they prepared for war, something else was happening across the galaxy. The humans were not waiting for the attack. They were building alliances. Ambassador stood before the Senate and told them what she had seen. She described the human fleet. She described their technology. She described the determination in their eyes and the steel in their voices. And she asked her people to choose a side. "For centuries we have survived by staying neutral," she said. We have traded with conquerors and bowed to tyrants. We have told ourselves that this is wisdom, but I have seen another way. I have seen a species that refused to bow. They hid in the darkness for 200 years and they built something powerful enough to challenge the. They are offering us a chance to be free, truly free. All we have to do is fight. The debate lasted 3 days. Senators argued and shouted and threatened to resign, but in the end the vote was clear. They would stand with the humans. Across the galaxy, similar conversations were taking place. They had been slaves of the for generations, but they had never stopped dreaming of freedom. When they heard the human broadcast, when they learned that someone had finally broken the in battle, they began to organize. Commander was a who had been born in chains. He had watched his parents die in the mines. He had seen his siblings sold to different masters. He had spent his entire life planning for a moment that he thought would never come. Now it had come. He stood before a gathering of resistance fighters in a hidden cave on their occupied. The humans are real, he said. They have a fleet. They are coming to challenge the Imperium, but they cannot do it alone and we cannot wait for them to save us. We must rise. We must fight. We must earn our freedom with our own hands. The rebellion began that night. Across a dozen worlds, slaves turned against their masters. They sabotaged factories. They destroyed supply depots. They killed soldiers in their sleep. Each act of resistance was small on its own, but together they created chaos throughout the Imperium. Even they who had remained neutral since the beginning of rule began to contribute. They were a species of scientists and scholars, not warriors, but they possessed something valuable. They possessed information. Intelligence officers began feeding data to the human fleet. Patrol routes, defense codes, weakness in shields. Every secret they had gathered in centuries of quiet observation was now shared with the enemies of the Imperium. General tours coordinated everything from Earth's war room. Holographic displays showed the positions of every friendly and enemy ship. Communications officers relayed messages to allies across dozens of star systems. Tactical experts planned operations that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Beside her stood Commander, who had escaped his world to join the coalition in person. Fleet Admiral commanded a task force of 200 ships that had been assigned to support the human advance. Representatives from a dozen smaller species offered whatever help they could provide. For the first time in 800 years, the galaxy was united against the. Colonel Chris Martinez trained the soldiers who would lead the ground assault. He was a veteran of the first battle against Koras, and he had seen what cruelty looked like up close. He wanted his troops to be ready for anything. They have never faced a real challenge, he told his soldiers during their final briefing. They have conquered weak species and called themselves strong. They have burned defenseless worlds and called themselves brave. Tomorrow, they face us. Tomorrow, they learn what it means to fight someone who can fight back. His soldiers were the best Earth had to offer. Men and women from every continent, trained since childhood in the arts of war. They carried weapons that could pierce armor and equipment that could survive any environment. They were not afraid. They were ready. Captain Price prepared her fighter squadron for the coming battle. She had grown up hearing stories about what they had done to humanity's first colonies. She had joined the military to make them pay. Check your systems, she told her pilots. Check them again. When we launch, there will be no second chances. We hit them fast, we hit them hard, and we do not stop until every ship is burning. Lieutenant Commander Kelly ran final tests on the weapon systems of the destroyer USS Defiant. Chief Engineer calibrated the jump drives that would carry the fleet across the galaxy. Every crew member on every ship knew their role and performed it perfectly. The coalition fleet gathered at the staging point, a nameless system far from any inhabited world. 8,000 ships in total, representing 5 different species united by a common goal. Human dreadnoughts flew alongside cruisers. Assault carriers prepared to deploy troops to liberated worlds. Even a handful of science vessels had been converted for combat support. Admiral Jake stood on the bridge of the USS Vanguard and looked at the fleet around him. 2 years ago, humanity had been a secret. A year ago, they had announced their return. Now they were leading an alliance that would either free the galaxy or die trying. He opened a channel to the entire fleet. All ships, this is Admiral, the enemy is waiting for us. They have more ships than we do. They have more soldiers than we do. But they do not have what we have. They do not have courage. They do not have justice. They do not have 200 years of pain and patience and preparation. He paused and let his words sink in. Today we end the Imperium. Today we set the galaxy free. All ships jump on my command. 8,000 engines flared to life. 8,000 ships aligned their jump coordinates. 8,000 crews held their breath. Jump! The Coalition fleet vanished into hyperspace, and the final battle began. The Coalition fleet emerged from hyperspace above Prime and found the entire armada waiting for them. Admiral Jake had known this moment would come. He had spent months preparing for it, planning every detail, imagining every scenario. But nothing could have prepared him for the sight that filled his. 10,000 warships hung in the void like a wall of metal and fire. Behind them, they glittered with the lights of 1,000 cities. Emperor's voice crackled over an open channel. So the fairy tale has come to die. I am impressed that you made it this far, human, but your journey ends here. Surrender now, and I will grant your species a quick death. Did not respond to the Emperor. He turned to Commander, who stood ready at her station. Status report. All ships in position. Weapons charged, crews standing by. Nodded. He had 8,000 ships against 10,000. The numbers were not in his favor, but numbers had never won wars on their own. Training won wars. Technology won wars. Courage won wars. And the Coalition had all three. All ships said quietly, advance. The two fleets crashed together like waves breaking against rocks. Energy beams carved through space. Missiles left trails of fire across the darkness. Ships exploded in flashes of light that could be seen from the surface of Prime. Captain Price led her fighter squadron into the heart of the enemy formation. Her pilots moved like dancers, weaving between capital ships, targeting weapons and engines and sensor arrays. They were too small to be hit by the main guns, too fast to be caught by the fighters sent to stop them. Stay together, she ordered her squadron. Focus on the command ships. Take out their coordination and the rest will fall. Her pilots obeyed without question. They had trained for this their entire lives. They knew exactly what to do. Commodore brought his cruisers forward and opened fire on the line. Plasma bolts the size of buildings slammed into enemy warships, cracking armor and detonating reactors. The heavy cruisers absorbed punishment that would have destroyed lesser vessels, their advanced shields flickering but holding. The forces attacked the flank, drawing attention away from the human advance. Admiral commanded her ships with cold precision, exploiting every weakness in the enemy formation. Her people had been neutral for generations, but they were learning quickly how to fight. The assault carriers moved toward the planet, carrying thousands of soldiers prepared to liberate the slaves below. Commander stood on the bridge of the lead carrier and watched his star grow brighter in the. Somewhere down there, his people were waiting for freedom. The battle raged for hours. Ships died on both sides. Brave crews fought until their vessels were torn apart around them. The void filled with debris and bodies and the screaming of damaged reactors. But slowly, inevitably, the Coalition began to win. They had ruled through fear for 800 years. They had never faced an enemy that refused to be afraid. They had never fought a war they could not win easily. And now, for the first time, they were losing. Emperor watched from the bridge of his flagship as his fleet crumbled around him. He had brought every ship. He had gathered every soldier. He had believed that nothing could stop the might of the Imperium. He had been wrong. Captain Price led her squadron on a final attack run against the enemy command ship. The vessel was enormous, bristling with weapons, protected by layers of shields. But Price had identified a weakness, a small gap in the defense grid where the shields overlapped imperfectly. "All pilots follow me," she ordered. "We end this now." Her squadron dove toward the gap, dodging fire from a dozen weapons platforms. 2 of her pilots were hit. 3 more took damage that should have destroyed them but somehow kept flying. Price did not look back. She could not afford to. She launched her missiles at point-blank range and pulled up just before impact. The warhead struck the command ship's main reactor. The explosion tore the vessel in half. Across the fleet, coordination collapsed. Ships that had been working together began making mistakes. Orders stopped coming from the flagship. Panic spread like a disease. Admiral seized the moment. All ships full assault pushed them back. The coalition fleet surged forward. Human dreadnoughts broke through the enemy line. Cruisers poured fire into the gaps. Carriers began their descent toward the planet's surface. Emperor fled his dying flagship in an escape pod, racing toward the planet below. He would hide in his palace. He would rally his ground forces. He would find a way to turn this disaster around. He never made it. Commandos were waiting for him when his pod touched down. They surrounded him before he could reach safety. Commander stepped forward and looked at the Emperor who had enslaved his people for generations. "The Imperium is over," said simply. "You will answer for your crimes." Above the planet, the battle was ending. Ships surrendered by the hundred. Those who tried to flee were hunted down and captured. Those who continued fighting were destroyed without mercy. When the last enemy weapon fell silent, Admiral stood on the bridge of the Vanguard and looked at what remained of the fleet. Thousands of warships drifted as wreckage. Thousands more flew coalition colors, their crews having surrendered rather than die for a lost cause. The war was over. The Imperium had fallen. President Daniel Hayes arrived on Prime 3 days later. He stood on the steps of the Imperial Palace, surrounded by soldiers and allies from half a dozen species. Cameras broadcast his image to every world in the galaxy. "For 3,000 years you believed we were a fairy tale," he said. "A myth, a ghost story whispered in the dark. You believed that humanity was gone, erased from the universe by those who feared what we might become." He paused and looked out at the crowd gathered before him. Humans stood beside. Species that had been enemies for centuries now celebrated together. "Today you know the truth. Humanity is real. We endure, we protect, and we never ever forget. They burned our worlds and tried to wipe us from history. They failed. And now their empire is dust and their slaves are free and the galaxy belongs to all of us." The celebration lasted for days. Across 1,000 worlds, beings who had lived in fear finally allowed themselves to hope. The great tyranny was broken. A new era was beginning. Admiral Jake retired to a small house on the coast of California. He had spent his entire life preparing for war. Now he wanted peace. He sat on his porch and watched the sun set over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. Visited him sometimes. So did Price and all the others who had fought beside him. They would sit together and remember the friends they had lost and the victory they had won. Sometimes, at night, would look up at the stars. He would think about the 200 years of silence that had protected humanity while they rebuilt. He would think about the generations who had sacrificed everything so that this moment could happen. The silence was gone now. Earth was no longer hiding, but that was all right. Because Earth was no fairy tale. Earth was home, and humanity had finally come back to the stars where they belonged.